We'll begin in just a moment, soon as we get a few more people in here. There we go. Okay, well, a few more people coming on. Good. One, that's good. That's good. Okay. Well, good evening. Certainly glad you're with us this evening. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom, and this is the resurrected version of the Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies, where we promise to offer Jewish learning on a university level, but without final exams, no sororities, and no football team. And we're glad to have you along, and we hope that we'll have a wonderful opportunity to learn together and to grow together. If you're here on Zoom, just make sure that you stay muted. If you have a question you'd like to ask, a point you'd like to make, if you can, at the bottom of the screen, there's a thing that says chat. Just send me a little chat, and I would be delighted to try to address all your questions and answer all of your religious searching. And by the time you're finished, you will be an enlightened human being filled with the joy of Torah. So glad you're with us. Just letting a few more people come on so that everybody can find us. So glad you're here. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, we're delighted to have you as well. If you're on Facebook and you'd like to ask a question, I can see the questions, I can see the comments. So if you want to write something in the comment box, I will try my very best to address you there. So welcome. We're going to be learning, we're going to be talking about the questions that don't go away. We're scheduled for 3 sessions in March, and then the 4th one in March will be a special preparation for Passover session, and then we'll move into April and do a few sessions in April, and we'll see how this goes. Perhaps we'll continue this for a little bit longer, and maybe, God forbid, we'll actually get home. We'll get back to the shul and get a chance to see each other. So glad you're here. Let's begin together. I was 17 years old and a freshman in school, freshman in college. And I would speak to my parents every Friday afternoon just before Shabbat. And the Friday afternoon, the week before Thanksgiving, my mom says to me, the rabbi would like, when you come home for Thanksgiving, the rabbi would like you to lead a, lead a service for collegians in the synagogue. And I said to my mother, you know, I love the rabbi and I love the shul, but I'm really not interested in leading a service. She said, the rabbi's going to be disappointed. I said, yeah, but that's how I feel. That's how I feel. So I got home for Thanksgiving and she said, oh, the rabbi would like to see you. I said, oh, great, wonderful. Now I have to go justify myself. So I went to go see my rabbi, who was a wonderful, wonderful rabbi. And he said, what's your problem? And I said, I have no problem. I'm just not interested. I don't find that the services in the synagogue really speak to me anymore. I'm not angry at you and I'm not angry at the shul and I'm going to stay Jewish. You don't have to worry. I love the shul and I love you. But this was a moment, you know, of course, this was the early 70s. And this was, the Vietnam War was raging and I had friends who were being drafted. Feminism was growing in the world and all the women in my life were beginning to realize themselves. The counterculture was virulent in the world and we were rethinking all of the values by which we lived. And you would not have known any of that from the synagogue services that I attended. So I said to him, it's just not my world anymore. I'm just not interested. And he didn't get angry. He was, to his credit, a wonderful, wonderful wise man, said, turn around and there's an orange book at the end of that 3rd shelf. Pick it up and let me see it and bring it out. And I got this book and I opened it. He said, open the very first page and read the very first page for me. Read it out loud. And this is what I read. He said, it is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. I said, hey, he's been to our shul. That's our shul. When faith is replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks in the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. These are the opening words to Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, God in Search of Man. Heschel, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, and this is his perception of the problem. He wrote this book in the 1950s and published it in 1964. We tend to think that religion was eclipsed by science and philosophy, and Heschel said, no, it's because religion forgot what it was for. And here is his answer. What is religion for? Religion is an answer to our ultimate questions. I would go one step further. Religion isn't only an answer to our ultimate questions. Religion is the way that we frame our ultimate questions. Religion is all about the questions. And he says the moment we become oblivious to those questions, the moment we stop asking those questions, the moment we become afraid of those questions, then religion becomes irrelevant to us, that it has nothing to say to us. It's important to keep those questions in front of us. And the moment that we were talking, my rabbi and I, was a moment when those questions were so very important because the world was falling apart. There was in 1970, there was a tremendous sense of an apocalyptic sense of being unbolted from reality. And I would suggest that the same thing is happening to us at this moment now too. Certainly the pandemic has shaken us. The way that we live our lives is completely different than even a year ago. And beyond that, the politics of this moment have made us begin to question exactly what is going on. And the cultural moment presents the same kind of environment in which my rabbi asked me to come and lead a service. And I felt the same way. And part of the reason I'm offering this class is because I don't want any young person to ever come back to me at some point and ask me the same thing. Why didn't religion talk to the questions that don't go away? Why doesn't faith ask those questions with me? When we become oblivious to the questions, when we become afraid of the questions, when we hide from the questions, when we're worried about how to answer them, then we really have nothing left to say. And our survival as a culture isn't really the issue anymore. We become irrelevant. I want to suggest to you that Judaism, religion in general, and Judaism in specific, is all about asking the great questions of life. The Bible is a book of questions. In fact, if you look at the Bible in a certain way, the very best way that I know to read the Bible is to look at the questions that are asked in any particular episode. In the very first chapters of Genesis, God asks the question of the entire corpus. Ayeka, he says to Adam, where are you? Where are you hiding? What are you hiding from? How much of yourself and how much of your truth are you hiding from? And in a certain way, all of Torah is an answer to that question. You turn the page and there's another question. God asks Cain, where is your brother? And the answer is, Hashomer achi anochi. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for my brother? Who is my brother to me? And you turn a few more pages, and God reveals to Abraham that he's about to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham asks the divine, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat? Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? It's almost like the questions in the Torah are highlighted. They're written in red, they're italicized. It's almost as if the entire narrative is really just a pretext to present the question, because the question jumps off the page. We are a question asking people. We have always been question asking people. And we have to have the courage to ask those questions forthrightly. It's the first thing that all of us learned as Jewish people. When we were little kids, the first thing we learned, the first time we were invited to join a ritual, we stood on the chair at the Seder table and we squeaked out, "Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halilot." Imagine that. The first religious act of a child is not the affirmation of faith. It's not the memorization of a catechism. It's not an assertion of belief. The first thing you do is ask a question. We teach you to ask a question because the open mind, the searching soul, the spirit that is in quest, inquisitive, is really what this tradition is all about. The Seder actually contains 4 questions, and not just the 4 questions of Manish Tana, but the 4 different styles of the question: a Chacham and a Rasha and a Tam and a Sheno Yodei Lishol. The Chacham, the kid who is privileged as the Chacham, is the wise one. He asks a how question. How do I keep all the rites and rituals, the traditions and customs of the Seder? But really the most interesting question is the second one. The kid who says, Mazel Lachem, what's all this mean to you? What does the narrative of the Seder mean to you? What does the narrative of the Torah mean to you? What is the narrative of your life? Where is the struggle for freedom in your life? Mazel Lachem, what does all this mean to you? The why question. And it's terribly unfortunate that the tradition castigated him as the Rasha. And don't think it's because the reason listed in the Haggadah. The reason listed in the Haggadah is, lachem v'lo lo, that he says, mazel lachem, what is this to you? Go look at the wise kid's question. He also says, to you. But we're a lot more comfortable with how questions than with why questions. Because a how question just brings a recitation of religious custom. It's the why question that makes you ask yourself something deep and powerful. Why am I doing this? What is the meaning of this? Where does it fit in my personal narrative? How does it connect to my own sense of meaning? That's the really very deep question of the Haggadah. The third kid says, Mazot, what's going on? And you could look at that in either of one of 2 ways. Either he's not very bright because he doesn't understand how powerful this evening is, or else quite the contrary. He's taken with the wonder of the whole thing. And he realizes there isn't much more to ask simply than tell me the story. But it's the 4th one that always gave me pause. She'eno yodei lishol, a kid who doesn't know how to ask a question. What kind of Jew doesn't know how to ask a question? At least you ask, when do we eat? That was asked at my Seder table. Or what page are we on the Haggadah? Or how long is this going to go on for? But a person who sits silently at the Seder, that's a great tragedy. Doesn't have a question to ask, isn't moved by the ritual at all, has no place in the story that raises a question. Rabbi Schulweis made a remarkable observation. He said, She'eno yodei lishol is not a kid who is silent because he has nothing, he's dumb, he can't articulate. It's not a kid who's a baby who has nothing to say. She'eno yodei lishol was yesterday's Rasha. Yesterday he came to our Seder and he said, Mazel lachem. Yesterday, he came to our synagogue. He came to our ritual. He came to our faith. He came to our tradition. And he said, show me how this connects to my search for meaning in life. Show me how this connects to my personal narrative. And we said to him, you're a Rasha, get out of here. And he did. And he did. So he comes to the Seder, but he sits silently because we told him to shut up. And that's a catastrophe. That really is a catastrophe for our tradition. You know that the fastest growing religious group in the United States are the nuns. N-O-N-E-S, nuns. They're the ones that, when asked on religious surveys by the Pew people and others, what is your current religion? They check the box none. Not Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu. Not Orthodox, conservative, reform, renewal, reconstructionist, Zionist, not Zionist, none Jews. Jews who have no connection, religious folks who have no connection, because they came to our religious traditions and they asked these questions and we told them to go away. And that's a catastrophe. That's a genuine catastrophe. Because if you want to know the truth, we do have answers. And even when we don't have answers, religion doesn't necessarily have to answer every question. Religion has to give us an ability, an articulation, a way of framing the question. And that's exactly what faith is supposed to do. We are commanded to ask questions. Because the Torah says, "Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha." You will love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. You see the word all? What does it mean to say with all your heart and soul and might? It means that religion is to integrate head, heart, and hands. Believing, behaving, and belonging. All of us has to be involved in this enterprise of faith. And when faith is ever separated, when head and heart are separated, when head and hands are separated, when we don't believe what we're doing, or we don't do what we believe, or we feel no passion for any of it, that's when religion falls apart. That's when Judaism falls apart. When you can imagine a Judaism of belonging without believing, that's when you end up with a kitschy ethnic Judaism of bagels and lox and fiddler on the roof songs and simple Yiddish phrases, but no real moral depth. And that's been a problem in our community. I understand why it's been a problem in our community. I understand why we have avoided questions for more than a generation. You consider what happened in the last generation. Greatest moment of destruction in all of Jewish history was the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 by the Romans, Churban Habayit. It sent us into 1800 years of exile. The destruction of the temple, the greatest moment of destruction, and yet the Holocaust matches it or exceeds it. And the greatest moment of redemption, of rescue in all of Jewish history, the highest moment of all of Jewish history is the Exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the recreation of the state of Israel with all of its attendant miracles matches it or exceeds it. Problem is that Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and Churban Habayit, the destruction of the temple, came 1,500 years apart. The Holocaust and the resurrection of the recreation of the state of Israel came in the same generation. How does a people deal with that? How does a people wrap their heads around that kind of a oscillation between utter destruction and miraculous redemption? Well, we didn't. What we did was we took all of the great questions of the tradition, all the great questions of faith, all the great questions of belief, and we put them on ice and said, don't ask them. Don't ask them. They're not appropriate. We're not going to talk about that stuff. We'll talk about Jewish education. We'll talk about Jewish survival. We'll talk about the Jewish family. We'll talk about Israel. We'll remember the Holocaust, but we're not going to ask, what is the truth? What is the great truth that the Jewish tradition is trying to teach? What is the great message that underlies the entirety of the Jewish tradition? We're not going to ask that question. And when anyone ever showed up and did ask the question, well, we hammered them down. We simply waved our finger and said, don't forget the 6 million. A child came and said, why should I be Jewish? What's in it? What does it teach me? What is it for? We said, don't forget the 6 million. I understand why we did that. Maybe that was the proper emotional response for that terrifying moment. But what happened is we raised a generation of people who asked questions and never got their questions answered. And a question deferred is a question denied. And a question denied leaves us bereft. It leaves us broken without a truth. Without a truth. You read the great Moses Maimonides. You read his interpretation of Judaism. For Maimonides, Judaism isn't about belonging to the Jewish people. That's a nice thing. For Maimonides, Judaism isn't about the good feelings we get when we see the Israeli flag or hear the sounds of Hatikva. Those are wonderful. For Maimonides, Judaism is all that, but more than that. It rests on a truth. It rests on a deep foundation of truth. That is, questions asked, questions framed, questions pursued, and questions answered. And that's what we need to do. If we're going to offer a Judaism to our children and our children's children that they're going to hold on to, it's not enough simply to offer sweet memories of the Shabbos table, although that's important, or nice memories at camp, although that's very important. I think they want truth. I think they want a message. I think they want an ideology, a philosophy, something that says, this is where we stand. This is what we believe in. This is who we are. So what I'm going to try to do in the weeks tonight and in the weeks ahead is to sketch out an answer to some of the deepest questions of the Jewish faith, Jewish tradition, to begin to think about who we are and what we believe and where we stand and what are the texts that these things are found in and where they come from. Tonight, I want to begin with a very simple question, kind of an easy question. Who are we? What is our message? I spoke once to a college class. A friend of mine was teaching a comparative religion class in a local college. And a wonderful class, bright people, adults and young people and older people mixed up as you get in a community college. And they'd been studying, it's a comparative religion, so they'd studied all the different faiths and they were reading the books and they were visiting the places, and I was one of their guests. And a young man asked me a very good question. He said, I'm a Christian, and I can tell you what the Christian message is. Attach yourself to Christ and you will achieve eternal life. And I think I can tell you what the Buddhist message is about separating, detaching from the attachments of life and finding an equanimity. And I think I can summarize the Muslim message. What's the Jewish message? What's the deepest message of the Jewish faith? I mean, it's not fair to say an elevator speech. Remember that story of the stranger who comes to Rabbi Hillel and says, tell me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. But certainly we have to have a message. So let's take a look together at the message that the Jewish tradition tries to offer. And what I'd like to do is to begin at the beginning, to begin with a text. And the text that I'd like to offer, not that one, this one, comes from Genesis. Let's take a look at this text together. And I want to point out there's so many ways to read this and so much depth of interpretation that one could pursue, but I want to read it in a particular way. So I want to begin here with the second chapter of Genesis. There's two stories of creation in Genesis. And I want to begin with the second one. When the Lord God made heaven and earth. And now the Bible is going to give us a picture of the pre-created reality. When no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grass of the field had sprouted, because the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the soil. So the Bible implies that there's two things you need in order to have life in this world. One is moisture, and the other is a human being to cultivate and protect it. But a flow welled up from the ground and watered the whole surface of the earth. There's your water. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now that's a beautiful image. Who are we? We are the dirt of the earth, risen up, and God has blown life into us. The Hebrew word for earth is Adamah, and the Hebrew name for the human being is Adam. Now, I don't mean that to be disparaging. You're walking dirt. Thank you very much. But really, it's a dual reality. I want you to see the duality of this. We are earth. We are of the earth. And yet there's one thing about us that isn't of the earth, and that is God did us artificial respiration and blew life into us. Blew life into us. And that's why we live. So part of us is one with the earth, and part of us is one with God. Now, just to get clear about this, let's just follow this up for just a second. God breathes into us. So breath has always been something that religious traditions have focused on. In Hebrew, the word nishama, which means soul or life force, is related to the word linshom, which means to breathe. The word ruach means breath. It also means wind and spirit. Ruach means spirit. In English, it's the same thing, by the way. You say the word spirit, spiritus. It's the root of inspiration. It's the root of respiration. And when you die and your library books are overdue, that's expiration. Spiritus, ruach, neshama, recognizes that there's something uncanny about breath. because breath is of me, but it's not of me. It connects me with the world outside. If you ever believe that you are self-contained and don't need the world, just try holding your breath for 3 or 4 minutes and see what happens. And the idea that breath is what God puts into us, and that's what keeps us alive, means that with every breath, you are recreating the very first breath, that very first breath of life. So here's the interesting thing about this. There's a name for God in the Bible, but we never say it. Kind of weird, a name you don't say. I mean, what good is a name if you can't say it? It used to be said. People used to pronounce it all the time. And at a certain point in Jewish history, the rabbis took it out of circulation because they didn't want people abusing it. It's spelled Yud Hey Vav Hey, but nobody knows how to pronounce it. Because in the first century, the rabbis took it out of circulation, didn't let anybody say it. When we see Yud Hey Vav Hey, we say the word Adonai, which means my master. That's not Yud Hey Vav Hey. Nobody knows how Yud Hey Vav Hey is supposed to be pronounced, except me. And I'll tell it to you, but you got to promise me it doesn't go any farther because this is a family secret. Yud Hey Vav Hey. Anyone know a little Hebrew? What's the sound of a Yud? Yah. What's the sound of a Hey? Ha. What's the sound of a Vav? Va. Or in the old days it was Wa. What's the sound of another Hey? That's hey. Another Ha. All right, so here I'm going to just do it once. So pay very close attention. Ready? Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Now you do that. Now keep doing that till the end of the lecture, okay? Don't stop. What does that mean? What does it mean that the name of God, the identity of divinity, is in fact the sound of a human breath? It means that the closest you can come to experiencing the closeness of God is in your very next breath. There's a book in the Bible of poetry called the Book of Psalms. And the last psalm, the last line of the last psalm says, Kol hanshama tehalel yah. Every breath is praise to God, because every breath is a reiteration of the first breath, because every breath is an affirmation of the closeness of divinity to us all, that life is not something we chose or got on our own or earned or deserved. Life was a gift from somewhere beyond us. It's a fragile gift. It's a miraculous gift. It's a wondrous gift. If you were ever in the delivery room and watched a child enter the world, the kid comes in the world kind of purple and then starts to breathe, and purple turns to pink, and life enters the child. And it's the most remarkable thing. And if you've ever been with someone you cared for who breathed their last, they're there in front of you. They're right there. They look the same, except something is missing. And it's the breath of life. It's the Ruach Nishmat Adonai, the breath of God. Nishmat Chayim. In that story, we are made of the same stuff as the earth. We are one with the earth. In that story, we are made of the breath of God. We are one with God. Let's take a look for just a moment back a little bit. Let's go back to the first chapter of Genesis. It's a different story. It has a different point of view. But take a look and see what it says, right? When God began to create heaven and earth, or in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. And God said, let there be light. Now, it's wonderful here because the phrase "let there be light" is a beautiful translation. It's poetic and it's rhythmic, but it's not what it says in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's a 2-word phrase with no consonants except the very last letter. It's Yehi Or. God uses no tools to create the world. God uses no materials to create the world. God simply opens God's mouth, as it were, and breathes reality into the world, as if to say, light. And light comes into the world. And there was light, and God saw that light was good and separated the light from darkness. And the light was day, and there was evening and morning, a first day. And then we have the creation of man in this story, which is different than the story we just had. Listen to this one. And God said, now who is he talking to? Everything else God creates, God doesn't start by saying something, he just does it. But when it comes to the creation of the human being, there's a moment of reflection, a moment of planning, a moment of premeditation. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. But salmenu kitmutenu. They'll rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth. Man will be God on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Look at that line again. It's a remarkable line. It's grammatically an awful mess, but remarkable. God created man in his image. Now, it's been a long philosophical question in the Jewish tradition. What does that mean? What part of us is the image of God? Is it our reason, our imagination, our compassion, our care, our creativity, our dominance over the world, our love? What part of us is the divinity within us? That's a remarkable question. Second phrase, in the image of God, he created him. In the image of God. So we bear an image of God. It's going to be interesting because when the 10 commandments are given, you remember what the second commandment is? You will make no image of God of anything on earth. You're not permitted to make an image of God, not of anything on earth. So Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great philosopher we learned before, he asked this question: if you're not allowed to make an image of God of anything on earth, how does God get away with it? And his answer was, it's not that you're not allowed to make an image of God. It's that there's nothing on earth that can be an image of God, because anything you might attach yourself on earth and say, this is the image of God, that's idolatry. That's a limitation on God. But there is one medium out of which you can make an image of God. And what is it? The wholeness of a human life. That's the great task, to create an image of God out of the wholeness of your life. And then one more thing, male and female, he created them. Same moment, together as one. So what do we have so far? We have a God who creates a world out of himself, as it were. So there's a fundamental oneness between God and the world. A God who creates the human being out of the dust of the earth. So there's a fundamental oneness between us human beings, we human beings, and the earth and the nature, the world of nature from whence we grow. A God who in one story creates us in the divine image, and in the other story creates us with the divine breath. So there is a fundamental oneness between human beings and God. And here, a God who creates human beings, male and female, together. So there's a fundamental oneness between between male and female in the world. Let's go one more step. You ready? Having created a world, back in chapter 2, the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the man who he had formed. And he caused from the ground to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. I like that sentence a lot. I'll tell you why. Because it's pleasing for the sight. I mean, you could have imagined he could have gotten away functionally, because all we needed was food trees. But there's something about that sentence that says aesthetics are necessary for the flourishing of human beings. You needed pretty trees, not just fruit trees. And the tree of life in the middle and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. We'll come back to those trees in a minute. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to till it and tend it. Le'avda u'leshamra. Now, just consider for a moment, why a garden? Why is our first home a garden? Why isn't our first home a palace? Why isn't our first home a shopping mall? Why isn't our first home? Why a garden? Of all places that God could have put us. Anyone do gardening? Gardening is an interesting thing, because if you have a garden, you know that it is a remarkable meeting place of nature and artifice, of human planning and effort, and the things that nature does. I'm going to suggest to you that the story of Genesis is a story of a world of oneness. That's the theme that runs through this whole story. Oneness between us and nature, oneness between us and God, oneness among us as people, oneness between God and the world he creates, oneness. And what is a better symbol of oneness, of unity, of symbiosis, of environmental harmony than a garden, where everything nurtures and feeds everything else, where everything has a place, where everything is part of a larger whole, a garden. And he puts the man in the garden, and the Torah then adds 2 words to the sentence. And there's a rule of reading Torah, in case I never taught it to you, which is that every word in Torah counts. Every word's $1 million, because some poor Jew had to schlep this on his back for 3,800 years. So every word matters. Le'avda u'lishamra. In case you ever wondered, what's the purpose of human life? There it is. You are put in the world to nurture, to protect, to cultivate. This translation says to till and to tend the world. That's why you were put into the world. So, digression for a moment. The kids in our day school, they have lunch every day, of course, and we have these big blue bins where they can put their recycling. So the kids came to me one day and they said, Rabbi, is it a mitzvah to recycle? And I said, yeah, I guess. Of course it's a mitzvah to recycle. They said, good, if it's a mitzvah to recycle, if it's a religious imperative to recycle our wrappers and our potato chip bags, and it's a mitzvah, you said it's a mitzvah, right? I said, yeah. I said, good. What's the bracha? Smart kids. Because if there's a mitzvah, it must be a bracha. So we did a little research together and we wrote the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Blessed is God who has commanded us lishmor la'avod et hagan, to nurture and tend God's garden. That's our mitzvah. That's our purpose for being in the world. And that's also a connection of oneness between human beings and the natural world that we are not just part of, that we are in that world, we are of that world, and that world is in and of us. All right, one more story. You ready? So God puts this human being into this world, right? God puts this human being in the world. And then the most remarkable thing happens. The Lord God said, this is verse 18, it is not good for man to be alone. Lo tov heyot adam levado. Now, think about that for a minute. What does that mean? That means God says, oops, I made a mistake. I made a mistake. I only created one human being. And I put him in the garden, and I thought that would be enough because it's paradise for him. I mean, what else does he need? He has the remote control. He doesn't need anything else. And yet, he's not whole all alone. There is something missing when the human being is all alone, even if he's in paradise, even if he's in God's garden. Lo tov heyot adam levado. It isn't right. He's not whole. I need to make him a helper, a second. I need to make him a companion. It is part of the human being to seek companionship. And God is learning this. God says, there's only one of me. I made one human being. But one human being isn't enough. He's not whole. His creation isn't whole as a single human being. And so, experiment number 1, the Lord God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and the birds of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called the creatures would be its name. And the man gave names to the cattle and the birds of the sky. But for Adam, no fitting helper was found. This is a great cinematic scene. Someone's got to film this one day. I mean, you stick the man in a tree and you bring him all the animals and you see which one he's going to love. You need companionship. You need something to make you whole. All right, here I got for you. A puppy dog. What could be nicer than a puppy dog, you know? And he hands him the puppy dog. But what happens? It's not right. I mean, I like the dog, says Adam. I like the dog. He's adorable. He's a Zisa creature, but it's not for me. All right, God says, okay, I'll pussycat. All right, a sheep, a cow, a snake. What do you want? I'll create anything you want. And he creates him all these creatures, but he can't find the companion that he wants. Now, this is serious. I'm making fun, but it's very serious, really. And what is it trying to say? That there's no animal that can fill the human need for companionship. Why not? Why not? Well, on one level, because we can't speak to them in a certain way. The great philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, you could tell your dog to go get your slippers, but you can't tell your dog that your parents were poor but honest. But let me make it harder. Why doesn't God be his companion? There are traditions where you marry God. Why doesn't God come and say, all right, we'll talk. Let's be together. And what you get here is a very interesting statement. The religious life does not exhaust the human need for companionship, even if you have an intimacy with the divine. Neither does an intimacy with nature. Something else is necessary. And I wonder why. You could say, I can't communicate. I mean, it's hard to play chess with God because God's played all the games and knows how each one ends, right? It's hard to have an argument with God. He's like my mother, because before you open your mouth, he knows what you're going to say and why you're wrong, right? I was once teaching this to a classroom of kids, and a 10-year-old kid raises his hand in the back of the room, and I said, yeah? And he shouts out something that was astonishing. He said, they don't need him. I said, what? He said, Rabbi, look, my dog loves me. But if I let my dog go, he'd do just fine running around Encino. And God created this man. God could create another one. They don't need him. What we're looking for in companionship, what we're looking for in the world, in a friend, in a partner, in a soulmate, is someone who needs me. Someone who needs me and all of my flaws and all of my mistakes and all of my failures and all of my shortcomings. Someone who says, yeah, but I still need you. That's the miracle of love, you know. I know your flaws and I still love you anyway. That's the miracle of I need you. And that's what we're looking for. So what does God do? Well, the next sentence is quite beautiful, right? So the Lord God caused a deep sleep upon the man. So why is falling in love like falling asleep? Because it's completely unconscious. Because you don't know, when my daughter was dating, she used to go out and she used to have these J dates, you know, she'd go on J date and she'd say to me, Abba, here's a guy and he looks perfect. On paper, he's perfect. They'd go meet for coffee. She'd come back with a frown on her face. I'd say, what happens? 2-word answer, no chemistry. On paper, he's perfect. But in real life, what are you going to do? Because it's completely unconscious why we fall in love with who we fall in love with. Why we fall in love with that person. So we fall, and on the opposite, it's true either. You wake up 2 years later and go, what was I thinking? You know, we fall in love. And while he slept, God took one of his ribs. The word in Hebrew is tsela, which can mean rib. It can also mean his side. I like that one better. It's not just a rib. He chopped him in half. He took the side and he closed up the flesh at that spot, arthroscopic surgery. And the Lord God fashioned the side or the rib that he'd taken from the man into a woman. And he brought her to the man. There's a beautiful midrash in this spot right here between the semicolon and the word and. He's about to wake up the man and the angels rush in and say, no, you can't wake him up. He can't see her that way. He's never met her. That's not the way you're going to meet your partner. So the story is the angels take this woman and they bathe her in the 4 rivers of the Garden of Eden. They crochet a dress, a wedding dress, out of the flowers of all the trees of the garden. And the last line of the midrash says, and God braided her hair. And then he wakes up the man. And this is the moment at the wedding. Every wedding is a reiteration of this moment, because every wedding, the chuppah is the tree of life. The woman who stands there, the person who stands there in a beautiful dress, are the flowers of the Garden of Eden. And he opens his mouth, he opens his eyes, he sees her. And this is the first words that man speaks in the world. And I think it's nice that it's a love song. He waxes poetic and he says, Zotapam, which literally means, this time, God, this time you got it right. This one is different. I like the Cocker Spaniel. I think the pussycat is adorable. The sheep, the cow, the snake, the rhinoceros, they're all wonderful. But this one's different. Why? Because she is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She is woman, from man she is taken. We are one. And then the Bible ends with this story with a wonderful line. Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so they become one flesh. They become one. But the important word in that sentence is hence. You see this word right here? In Hebrew, it's al-kain, which means, and so children, what do we learn from all this? If you were tempted to read the Bible as pseudoscience or bad history, that word destroys that. This is not science. This is not history. This is mythology. A myth is a truth wrapped up in a story. A myth is to be read in the present tense, not in the past tense. This is the greatest mystery in the world. We fall in love. We don't fall in love with our brothers and sisters. We fall in love with a person who's a genetic stranger. She's from Venus, he's from Mars. We come from different families. We are genetically different, and yet we need each other. We bond with each other. We cling to each other. We find friends in the world, partners in the projects of our lives, and we hold each other, and we find joy in one another. This is the great truth. Now, what is the image that is given us here? The image is given us here is that the world as it was meant to be was a world of oneness, a world in which men and women are one with each other. Humanity is one. A world in which humanity is one with nature. A world in which God and humanity are one. And a world in which God and nature, God and the world are all one. There is a oneness to this. But that's not the world we live in. So what happened to the world we live in? Well, the next story is all about that. The next story says they were naked, they were exposed, they were sharing with each other, and they felt no shame. But there was one animal in the whole garden, is the serpent, the Nachash, but which is not an animal, it's a principle. And what's the principle? The principle begins to whisper something to the woman. He says, did God say you can't eat of any tree? And the woman said, we can eat of any tree. It's only the tree in the middle of the garden we can't eat. Can't even touch it. And the serpent says, you're not going to die. God knows it. As soon as you eat, your eyes will be open and you'll be like divine beings who know good and bad. What is the serpent? He's the voice of temptation. More than that, what is the serpent? It's something that the psychologists called individuation. Individuation. God created us in the image of the divine. God is the creator. We are the creators. And what is the greatest creation each of us are responsible for? To create the self, to become the people we are meant to be, not who anyone, including God himself, has meant us to be. We are here to create ourselves. So the woman sees the tree that it was good for the eating and a delight to the eyes and powerful as a source of wisdom. She took of its fruit and she ate. What's supposed to happen when you eat from that tree? You're supposed to die, but she doesn't die. In fact, at that moment, he shows up. For some reason, she's now separate from him. And she sees it and she feels it and she wants it. And in that moment, there is an I that is born. I am separate from you and you are separate from me. And she hands him the fruit. And at this point, Adam, the man, has a choice to be made, right? If he eats or doesn't eat. What happens if he eats? And what happens if he doesn't eat? If he eats, he dies together with his wife. He disobeys the God who created him. But if he doesn't eat, then he's consonant with his God, but she dies. And he goes back to being lonely. What is it? Loneliness or death? Which is worse? And the man chooses death. He eats. And then they don't die. But something much more profound happens. They emerge as a choosing I, a choosing self, an individuated self. The eyes of both of them were open and they realized That I am I and you are you, and we don't share the world. We share the world, but we are not the same. We don't share our thoughts. We don't share our emotions. We conceal them. And what's the sign of concealing? They were naked. They put on clothing. They're now concealed. They're now concealed. And what happens? God shows up and says, did you eat of my tree? Did you eat of my tree? And it's that point, by the way, that the man blames the woman and the woman blames the snake, and they're punished. And the punishments are not punishments. The punishments simply set into reality the fact of individuation, that we are never again to be totally resonant with another soul. We can't completely read their hearts. All of us who have been married a while know this. You have these moments, you've been married a very long time to a person you love dearly, and yet some days that person does something and you look at them and says, really? Where did that come from? We live in separate bodies. We live in separate realities. We live in a separate subjectivity in our own hearts and our own souls. And we spend a lifetime trying to bridge that subjectivity to try and figure out who are you and who am I and how can we share this world? How do we share? We are broken up. Human beings are broken between themselves. Human beings and nature will now be broken, and human beings will be distant from God. And the brokenness of the world is what begins here. And the oneness of the world that was described in those early chapters of Genesis will never exist again. It'll never exist again. That's the situation of being human. That's the human condition. Loneliness, isolation, the longing for love, the longing for connection, the longing for connection with God, the longing for oneness with nature, that longing, that unyielding longing that we feel. That's the human condition. Now, if the book ended there, it'd be a very sad book. It'd be a very, very sad book. But that's only the beginning of the book, because there's one more idea. You ready? One more idea. One more idea. After these, as it were, punishments or consequences are handed down, here's the end of the story. And God said, now that the man has become one like us, knowing good and bad, now that he has intelligence, and now that he is individuated, what if he stretches out his hand and takes of the other tree and lives forever? So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to till the soil from which he was taken. He drove the man out and stationed east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, that's an angel, with a fiery, ever-turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life. So there is a garden with a tree of immortality in it. And God doesn't want us getting to that tree. So why not destroy the tree and destroy the garden? God doesn't do that. Okay, don't destroy the garden. Put a 9 million mile wall around it. And don't let anyone in ever. God doesn't do that either. What does God do? Just use your imagination now with me, okay? There's a gate to the garden, and he sends us out through that gate. So we now live outside the garden, which means we live outside this place of immortality, and we live outside this place of unity, of oneness, this garden of oneness. And the garden is guarded, the gate is guarded by an angel, a scary angel, with this fiery, ever-turning sword. So now imagine the following scenario. You ready? You're walking down Ventura Boulevard, and you get to the corner of Ventura Boulevard and Eden Avenue, and you turn right, and there at the end of Eden Avenue is the gate to the Garden of Eden. And right behind the gate is the tree of immortality. And the whole scenario of oneness, we can imagine a world of oneness. We can imagine immortality. We can dream of immortality. We just can't get there. That's the human condition. That's the human condition. We can imagine a world made one. We can imagine a world where human beings are in harmony with each other. We can imagine a world where we are in harmony with nature. We can imagine a sense of intimacy with the divine. We can't get there. But because the sword is turning, We can see it. We just can't get in. We just can't get in. That's the tragedy of being a human being. To imagine the way the world ought to be, we just can't get there. That's the tragedy. But wait, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. The tree, the tree is in the middle of the garden, right? And the angel's holding this sword, right? And the sword's a fiery sword. It's not just a turning sword. That'd be scary enough, thank you very much. But this sword's on fire. And if you're standing back at Ventura Boulevard and looking down Eden Avenue and you see that image, you're going to superimpose the two images one on top of the other. You're going to superimpose the image of the sword's fire on top of the tree. So it sort of maybe could have often maybe looked like the tree is sort of maybe on fire, but like it never burns up. A tree on fire that never burns up. I know that image from somewhere. Where's that from? A tree on fire that never burns up. Anybody ever know that image? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Where do you know a tree that's on fire that doesn't burn up? That's right. It's a bush in the Exodus. Got smaller. It's a bush. It's the bush. It's the signal that Moses was called by God to go and redeem the people Israel. The burning bush is the tree of life that follows Moses into exile, into the desert, and calls him back to his mission to liberate his people. But wait, we're not done yet. So God speaks to Moses from that bush and sends him to go liberate his people out of Egypt and bring them out of slavery, bring them to freedom. It's the tree that says you're responsible. It's the tree that says you're a people and you have a mission in the world. Come and be part of that mission. Wait, it's more than that. So Moses is going to take us out of Egypt. We're going to cross the Red Sea. We're going to meet God on Mount Sinai. We're going to receive all the commandments of the Torah. And among the commandments of the Torah, we're going to build the Mishkan, a shrine in the desert. It's going to have an Ark of the Covenant, the one that Harrison Ford found in a movie. It's also going to have a menorah. The first great menorah stood out front of the shrine, the Mishkan. And what was that menorah according to the book of Exodus? It was a giant golden candelabrum decorated with leaves and flowers and fruits. You build a candelabrum with leaves and flowers and fruits and branches, what does it look like? It looks like a tree. And when you light it, it's going to look like a tree that's on fire, but never burns up. The tree of life that is always waiting for us right there in the garden, in the place of oneness. That becomes the perennial symbol of the Jewish people. That six-pointed star business, that was 17th century, much, much later. The perennial symbol of the Jewish people is the menorah. You find it in the sarcophaguses or sarcophagi of Jews buried in Rome in the catacombs. You find it in medieval manuscripts decorated by the great scribes of the Jewish tradition. You find it over the door lintel of the oldest synagogue in the world, the Alte Neue Shul in Prague. You find it across the street from the Knesset in Israel. It is the oldest symbol of the Jewish people. Why? Because it's the tree of life that is waiting for us to build a world of oneness and achieve the blessings of immortality that God promised us. That's the perennial task of the Jewish people. We are to bring the oneness of the garden into our world, and we're to bring our world into the oneness of the garden. Oh, how do you do that? Well, there's one more clue. How do you say tree of life in Hebrew? Eitz Chaim. What else is called an Eitz Chaim in the tradition? The Torah. Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tomchecha meushar. It is a tree of life. The purpose and meaning of the Jewish tradition is to teach us to recover the oneness of the Garden of Eden, to teach us to recover a oneness among human beings, a oneness with nature, and a oneness with God. That is the purpose and meaning of the whole Torah tradition. That's what we're here in the world to do. Now, there's a word for that. The word for that is Kedusha. The word Kedusha is translated as holy, or sacred, but there's a better way to understand the word Kedusha. If you think about how the word Kedusha is used in the tradition, you'll understand what the concept is. When a family, a group of friends, a chavurah stands together at a Shabbos table or a Yontif table, and we hold each other's hands and we recite a prayer over a glass of wine, that prayer is called Kiddush. We're not sanctifying the wine. The wine is Manischewitz. It's not good wine. But the circle of family and friends, of love and care around that table, that's what's sanctified. When two people love each other and they bond together for life in a bond of responsibility and affection, you turn to each other, you put a ring on someone's finger and you say, Hare at mikudeshet li. The word for marriage in Judaism is kiddushin. When the person I love dies and I maintain a connection with that person, I don't want death to sever our relationship, my love, my care, my affection, what I've learned from that person that is still so very much alive. I stand up in a minyan and I recite a prayer of memory called Kaddish. Kiddush, Kiddushin, Kaddish. Holiness. Holiness is in oneness. It is in bonding. Every step we take toward the garden of bringing a little more holiness in the world, every step toward bringing more oneness into the world, every step we take toward bonding the world together as one from its brokenness to a wholeness is a step toward Kiddusha, holiness. And in the book of Leviticus, God makes the most astonishing commandment to our people. God says, you will kadoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai. You will be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. We share this quality of holiness, of oneness with God, because God is the circle that encompasses all. God is what bonds all things together as one. That's what we mean when we say Adonai Echad. And whenever we take a step in that direction, when we bond with one another, when we bond with a community, when we bond with the world, and we bond the world together, that is a step toward divinity. That is a step toward oneness. That's the eternal mission and the job of our people in the world. And that's what brings us joy in the end. That's what makes life worth living in the end. When we get back to Valley Beth Shalom, and God willing, it'll be very soon, when we all get vaccinated and it's safe, I want you to come into the building and I want you to come upstairs. And before you come into my office, which you're always welcome to do, of course, stand in the atrium on the balcony and look at the two windows. There's two windows there, two beautiful, magnificent stained glass windows. On the one on the right says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, Israel, God is alive and God is one. And then you'll see around the window is that phrase written in 18 languages. The oneness of humanity represented by that. God is one. And on the other window, opposite that, to the left, is the phrase, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You will love your neighbor, you will love the other, kamocha, as yourself, which is a line 10 verses after that line, Kedoshim Tihiyu. 10 verses later, it says you will love your neighbor, you will love the other as yourself. It doesn't mean love them as much you love yourself or love them the same way you love yourself. The word kamocha doesn't modify love. It modifies neighbor. Love the other who is yourself, who is just like you, who is one with you. Realize that you and the other are one. That the individuation which we strove for when we grew up is a true fact. That's how we live in the world. But deep down, there is a deeper truth that we are one. And when you are able to love the other who is one with you, then you will understand what God means when God says, I am one. We are all one. It is all one. To reach toward oneness is what the Jewish tradition has always been about. The world is broken. And it's our job to take steps toward oneness. And that's why we're in the world. That's enough for one night. I hope that you enjoyed that. Tonight we talked about the meaning and purpose of Jewish existence. Next week I want to begin with theology, and I want to ask a really basically simple question. Who is God? What does it mean to believe? What difference does it make? And what does it mean in the Jewish tradition to say Adonai Echad, God is one? So I hope you'll join us next week. During this next week, of course, you're always welcome to join us. Friday night, we have Kabbalat Shabbat. Shabbos morning, Torah study at 9 o'clock, followed by davening at 10, and Rabbi Hillel Silverman at about 11:30. Oh, one more announcement on behalf of the management. Every family at VBS has a shlach manos, has a mishloach manot package waiting for you. If you didn't pick yours up, you have to go pick them up at the shul. So you can go get them tomorrow between 10 and 2, or get them on Friday between 1 and 4. So please go and pick up your mishloach manot. They're beautiful, and the humantashen are still fresh. And according to the Jewish faith, you're allowed to eat humantash this entire week. So go get your humantash. Go enjoy your mishloach manot. Thank you for being part of our series. We'll see you next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. If anyone has questions, comments, counter sermons, send them to me, and we'll continue our conversation. Take good care, everyone, and stay well.